Hey everybody, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. So if you're new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. So I know I'm getting a little bit lower on some of the lost gold mines and that those kind of stories, but this is a phenomenal story today, and it's going to be along those lines. And there's a lot of different tangents on this story. It's probably going to take 2 videos to cover everything and not make the videos too long, but today we're going to talk about Slumach's Lost Gold Mine. It's also called the Pitt Lake Lost Gold Mine or the Lost Creek Mine. This is in southern British Columbia in the really, really rough mountain area where there's pretty much no settlements. It's way out in the, in the back country in the mountains. So anyhow, this story originates back in the late 1800s, probably 1870s, 1880s. I don't know exactly when this Katzie First Nations man found this discovery or when he was showed, where this was at. But he was taking gold out of there for a while. So anyhow, this story does involve a lot of famous prospectors or very well-known Canadian prospectors, some of which disappeared, some of which found some gold and maybe didn't make it back to this particular site because, like I said, it's extremely remote, extremely rough, extremely difficult to get to, and there have been a lot of people that have disappeared going looking for this lost source of gold. And there have been people that have found it and they've come back and they've contracted mysterious illnesses. There have been people that have just disappeared off of the face of the earth when going to look for it. There have been a lot of different twists and turns. And we'll go down a lot of these different tangents on, these different famous prospectors that went looking for it and some of the details that they said or what they found or, any of these kind of details, because there's a lot to this story. And some of these stories, we could possibly be talking about a couple of gold find locations that maybe are in fairly close proximity to each other. With these different people's stories, it's hard to know exactly if they were all coming from this gold was coming from the same source or not. So anyhow, but the story basically starts out in the late 1800s in British Columbia, Canada. This gentleman, he was known by the name of Slumach, and like I mentioned, he is a Katzie First Nations Native American man, and he had been coming into this town of New Westminster, which is by Vancouver, British Columbia, and he would come in and he would have gold on him, and he would be bringing this gold and cash it in and buy his supplies and probably have a good time while he was in town and everything. And it got to where people noticed this was kind of a regular occurrence. I believe like toward the late summer or so. So he would go back into the mountains and amass a good amount of gold and then come back into town when he needed more food and supplies and stuff like that, and he would cash his gold in. And so people started to notice this, and I believe people tried to follow him back where he was going, but he was a Native American man. This was his territory. He knew it extremely well, and the general white population did not know these areas anywhere to the degree of the Native American people that this was their homeland, and that was this gentleman's case. So no one was ever able to follow him too far. And there's a few reasons we know about Slumach and his story and stuff like that. Part of it is because of the newspaper. Part of it is some oral tradition amongst the Katzie First Nation people. And and some other details. So essentially, what happened is Slumach was in this area near Pitt Lake, which was his area, the area he was from. And apparently, there had been a gentleman around there that had been giving him a hard time. At this point, this gentleman, Slumach, is pretty old. He's born in the early 1800s, and this is around 1890 or so when this situation happens. There was a gentleman named Louis B, and he had been giving Slumach a hard time, and apparently this gentleman was significantly younger than Slumach. Slumach was an old man at this point. So it depends if you believe what the newspapers write about it. Obviously, the newspapers at the time wrote stories in a anti-Native American, type of format, and so the details that Slumach had mentioned about things really weren't talked about much in the newspaper. They painted him out to be a bad person because basically what happened was this gentleman had been supposedly giving Slumach a hard time and threatening him with violence, and apparently the gentleman may have came after Slumach when they were checking their fishing lines on Pitt Lake, and this gentleman Louis was with another friend, and Slumach ended up shooting this gentleman Louis B, and apparently Louis B didn't survive, and so with one of Louis B's friends being in the canoe with him, or I think they had beached it on the shore, checking some lines, and got in an altercation. Well, of course, with the one witness on the one side, the story was of course told in a way that didn't make Slumach look good, and I think a lot of that was taken as fact. And Slumach had a pretty speedy trial, and he was hung. So there are some details that have come out about things, though, at this point, because at the very end of Slumach's life, he was with another Catesy First Nations gentleman that he was allowed to have by his side in the last week or so of his life, and so he shared a lot of details. Slumach shared a lot of details with this gentleman, and this gentleman's name was Peter Pierre. And this gentleman was also a Catesy First Nations man. So that's just a really quick overview of who Slumach was, what happened to him, why he was hung, and why he wasn't able to lead anyone else back to his gold find, and why we had these stories that came about afterwards. Now, people have been looking for this particular location where he found all this gold. They've been looking for over 100 years, and there have been different documentaries done where people have gone to look and taken different clues and had different expeditions, and we'll go over, some of those details from the different people that have been on expeditions and documentary details, including a great documentary that just came out just recently. I believe the people involved in this documentary, it's called Dead Man's Curse. They also followed a lot of these clues. Of course, we're, over 100 years behind looking for some of this stuff, but we have better technology and stuff now too. So anyhow, they followed a lot of these clues. They also involved some tribal elders that were relation of Slumach, and this current team did a really good job of putting together a great team with good talents to follow on the trail of Slumach over 100 years later and take a lot of those clues that they had from all these different sources, all these different prospectors that had said things and been on the search many years before. And so this team did a really good job. And that Dead Man's Curse is a really good documentary. Now, it's many hours of watching, and if you're into this kind of stuff, it might be something worth watching. And I'm here basically just to kind of summarize a lot of things so you don't have to watch, 5, 6, 8 hours of that stuff if you don't want to. Now, if you want to listen to the overviews of things and then watch and have kind of the gist of what's going on, then probably everything will make even more sense as you go through it. But like I mentioned, this 2022 documentary crew, they involved a couple of Native American people, First Nations people that were related to Slumach. And I believe they had said that there really wasn't a lot said about Slumach. I think because of how the papers made him out to be a bad person, and the First Nations people kind of struck him from from the record and from their oral stories and stuff like that. People didn't want to talk about it or whatever, and there wasn't a lot of information on him, or not a lot of oral stories into the current times. So anyhow, you had to find a lot of tribal elders that knew some of the stories and some of the things. And there had been multiple different documentaries done, through the years, but this new one is definitely really good. And it picks up where some of the other documentaries left off, and it picks up where various prospectors left off or picked up with some of the clues they left behind. So I mentioned that the media painted a really bad picture of Slumach, and it seems now that it probably was more likely a self-defense case, not the way that the newspaper, presented the story. But anyhow, those early articles actually don't mention any gold at all. They just paint a picture of a Native American warrior who they say had murdered somebody in cold blood, and that whole narrative is in there. There's no mention of gold or the fact that this gentleman Slumach was coming to town periodically, cashing in a lot of gold or whatever. So the first mention of Slumach being associated with gold happens in a 1914 article, some 23 years later, and I believe this article was in the Stevens Point Journal. And then there are multiple other occasions of mentions of gold with his name later on after that. So this new documentary team, though, while working in this new expedition and putting this together so they can go out and look and follow some clues and stuff. This First Nations woman that is part of this team, her name is Taylor Starr, and I believe she's a direct, I don't know if she was a direct descendant, actually, technically not a direct descendant. Slumach was her great uncle. So anyhow, she got into some archives. They found some details, and they found an old, early 1970s documentary where there was another Native First Nations woman named Amanda Charnley, and her father was Peter Pierre, who of course knew Slumach, and he was with Slumach in his final days. And Amanda tells this story of her father and Slumach, and in the story she goes on to say that her father was allowed to spend this last week with him, and on the day before he was executed, Slumach told him about the gold mine or the gold find location or source, and gave him enough detail that he should be able to find where it was located. And then, of course, we know what happened the next day. I think it was January 16th of 1891, and Slumach is hung, and all his firsthand account details, go, as far as that goes. So, and I think Slumach had also mentioned how he found this gold location was that he had to guide out, or he found a couple of lost native men that he helped guide back to safety, and this was in the upper Pit Lake region. So he guided them to safety, and they basically paid him with gold and told him where to find the source of this gold, and that's how he knew where it was, and he was familiar with, all the trails and trade routes through there and everything, so he was able to locate it. And that's what started him being able to find this gold and periodically bring gold in and be able to cash it in and have plenty of money from then on. And Amanda Charnley had said that she had heard this story ever since she was a little girl. She had heard the story of Slumach and the gold, and this was part of her stories that she had heard growing up pretty continuously. And so she was able to recount pretty well what her father had said that Slumach told him about the location, because she had heard this story repeated many times growing up. And she had said that Slumach went up the lake, and she said he went up these canyons. In a certain canyon, there was a beautiful, deep, yellow-colored moss-like gold. And I believe this was, some moss growing on the, in the valley or whatever. And she said that Slumach had peeled this moss back, and there it was. So I think she was talking about a big gold vein, and he got his penknife out and he dug some out. And that's basically what Amanda had said in this early 1970s documentary that is still in the archives in British Columbia. So with her words, it does appear that there was a big deposit of gold that was obviously a big enough deposit that it was able to be carved out with Slumach's penknife, and he had to have, carved some chunks out of there, and then apparently the area maybe had a fair amount of gold in it. So Amanda had said that her father went to look for this gold and follow these directions, but he fell from a boulder and he broke his hip in Second Canyon. So that's as far as he got, and then obviously had to retreat and heal up and everything. But it was also said that Slumach was said to have cursed this gold when he died, and many people have died or been injured or never seen again after going to look for this Lost Creek gold mine or Slumach's gold. So after talking to tribal members and elders, this new 2022 expedition, they've come to believe that the gold would likely be on or maybe right off of an old Native American trade route or First Nations trade route that would have been used to link these native settlements together, because that's more likely where people would be, going down these old ancient trails, unless those couple gentlemen got a little bit lost and got off track a little bit when they stumbled across the gold. But likely may not be too far off of these old trade routes. So while this new crew talked to Don Waite, and Don Waite is the gentleman that had interviewed Amanda Charnley, and he also had wrote a book about some of the lost gold mine details and some other Canadian history topics and things like that. But at the point that Don had interviewed Amanda Charnley. I believe Don was fairly young, maybe in his 20s or 30s or so at that point. But at this point in the early 70s, Amanda Charnley was getting pretty old. I don't know. She might have been at least in her 70s at that point. So she might have been born, maybe right around 1900 or somewhere around that point, maybe earlier. Maybe she was in her 80s at this point. It's hard to tell exactly. She's definitely old, and Don is significantly younger. But Don kept all of his notes from these interviews, and he did verify in his notes. I mean, he was a very meticulous note taker. He verified that Amanda did say that Slumach did find the gold in a canyon that had lots of yellow moss in it. So another clue found in the interview was that the lost men had come off of Patterson Creek off Glacier Lake. So these two lost men had come off of Patterson Creek, which was, I guess, near Glacier Lake. But the challenge is Patterson Creek is not on any maps as it appears today. So that might have been the name that they called the creek over 100 years ago, but not today. So this crew thought that the two men would have had to cross Snowcap Lake to Iceworm Creek, and that could be the same as Patterson Creek, but they didn't know for sure. So I told you we're going to go down a few different tangents with different people that have gone to look for this lost gold and people who may have been successful. And from what Slumach had actually said when he passed along the details, I believe he had said that the amount of gold there could make many, many men rich beyond their wildest dreams. So obviously, it wasn't a situation where there was just enough gold for someone to go in for a couple of years and then bring it all out. Apparently, this area was just loaded with gold. So about 10 years later, after Slumach was gone, so right around 1900, 1901, there was a gentleman and prospector named Walter Jackson, and he made lots of trips back into the Pitt Lake region and was rumored to have found Slumach's gold. So he came each fall with thousands of dollars in gold nuggets, and after his last trip, he fell very ill, and he wrote a letter with clues to the location of the fortune in gold, and he sent it to a friend. So this letter has since been copied from, other people, but it was said that some of those copies that still exist have key details changed, and probably done so to keep other people from finding the location or make it impossible to find the treasure, the gold. So unless, of course, you happen to have an original letter or a very early copy of the letter. So that's basically was the key early on. If you had an early copy of the letter, you should have all the details you need to go back in and find this lost gold location in this very rugged, remote, difficult landscape. And one man named Cyril Walters was said to have such a copy of this Jackson letter that he had obtained around 1922. And his letter had specific directions that led him to a location. Now, many of the letters seem to have some location details, things that you will see if you're in the right spot, like a tent-shaped rock, and a creek that disappears, and 3 peaks in a row. And some of those details are in the letters. And people believe that Cyril Walters and his partners actually did find the gold, or did find a good amount of gold, because they came back with gold, and they had pictures of huge gold nuggets and stuff like that they had found also. But there were some newspaper articles that this new team had looked up from basically this time from the 1940s with these Cyril Walters expeditions in British Columbia mountains, and they discovered that he had three partners. So they went in, they bring this gold out, and apparently there's still a lot of gold back in there still. And at this point, though, what they find out is as they're trying to look into these people that went in there in the 1940s and found gold, came out with gold, had pictures of of gold that they found and everything. All of these people involved in this expedition are no longer with us. So they did find an obituary in one of the newspapers for, I believe it was for. Might have been for Arthur Dick Carter. So Cyril Walters, the only partner that was known of his was this guy Arthur Dick Carter. And they obviously had two more partners, and anyhow, I don't believe Cyril Walters had any descendants or any relatives or whatever. So they looked for any details on Cyril Walters, couldn't find too much on him, but they did find his partner Arthur Dick Carter's obituary, and his obituary did give the names of his children and grandchildren and stuff that were alive still at the point that this gentleman, I believe he went by the name Dick Carter. But anyhow, at the point that he died, they did find in the obituary who some of his grandchildren were, and thought if we can find one of them, maybe we can get more details from the story. And they managed to find this gentleman, Ian Carter, and he had been passed a copy of the Jackson letter from his grandfather before he died, and he was still in possession of really a whole bunch of stuff, a box of stuff from the expedition. And once this new team met up with Ian Carter, he showed them a bunch of stuff. They gotta read the letter and look over everything and look at pictures and stuff like that. So this box was loaded with stuff. So it included like books, maps with locations marked and stuff like that, letters, black and white photos, including photos of huge gold nuggets that barely fit in your hand, and all kinds of like location pictures and stuff like that. So they probably took some pictures as they were on their expedition, so some of that I believe was also helpful in determining a possible route that they went on, and all kinds of important stuff was in this box. So the Jackson letter that was in this box appeared to be an original. And I believe the reason that they believed it was an original is it had a lot more location details and stuff like that than they had seen in other Jackson letters that they had seen through the years. And it wasn't in the best of shape. It was getting a bit brittle and everything. But it did mention that the gold was not more than 20 miles northwest of Pitt Lake. So this current team did mention that some of the photos included photos showing the men in the 1940s going across a glacier or an ice field, so they believe that they had to cross the Mamquam ice field. I don't know exactly how you say it. I think it might be Mamquam. And so they believe they had to cross this glacier or this ice field to continue to head in this direction towards where this valley of gold was. And, I mentioned before, this is very inaccessible area. You're not going to get into this area. I mean, I guess maybe you can come in by helicopter or something like that, but generally people are hiking and walking things in. It's it's not even country you can take a motorcycle or anything like that. So So it's rough going, and it takes a long time to go through these canyons and climbing up and down the mountains and across the ice fields and all this stuff. So it's not easy going. So as the current crew for this documentary went across this ice field, and they're continuing to look for this tent-shaped rock and looking for this creek that disappears, and these three peaks in a row. And at a certain point, they thought they found a rock that looked like a tent-shaped rock, but it was said that if you were at the right tent-shaped rock, that a lot of gold was stashed underneath this tent-shaped rock by the Jackson expedition, as they had all this gold that they had amassed together, and then were going to eventually hike it out, and they never were able to come back for it. So if you found the right tent-shaped rock, there would be a gold cache under it. But anyhow, this tent-shaped rock that they found when they were looking obviously either wasn't the right one, or I guess it's possible that in the past someone else might have found the tent-shaped rock and found the gold cache. But apparently, even if someone had done that, there still would be a source of the gold that had such a large amount, of gold. But this current expedition, they continued on, and they got to this area, Iceworm Creek, and then they found evidence near there of an old trail with a notch cut into the rock for a foothold. So keep in mind, this whole time, they're with some native people that know how to read the land, because it's stuff probably the greater majority of us wouldn't even notice some of the things that the native people were finding. And so anyhow, they pointed out this foothold that looks like it had been carved out of the rock for more easy footing. And of course you wouldn't do that unless you were coming back and forth continually through a particular area. You wouldn't do it if you went through an area once. But anyhow, and so they continued on, and they eventually reached area, or this field of yellow moss, kind of a valley full of this yellow moss. And they felt, hey, maybe they're close to this particular ledge that Slumach had peeled back this moss and found gold, and anyhow, so they were looking for a moss-covered bench with this rust-colored or yellow-colored moss, where Slumach had mentioned that he peeled the moss back and was able to carve gold out with his knife. But as they peeled a bunch of moss back in a bunch of different areas, they didn't find anything. And so in this area, there could be many different canyons that could have a carpeting of moss. So they might not have been in the right spot. You could even be in the same canyon, and if it runs like this for miles or whatever with all of this moss in it, how would you know if you were in the right spot? It just wouldn't be very obvious. So anyhow, but things seemed to match up. They felt like they were in somewhat of the right area and everything, and some clues were matching up. But like I said, they peeled back moss in quite a few areas. They didn't find anything. Now, I mentioned there's going to be a few different tangents, and I don't want to make this video too long, so we'll probably have a part 2, because we need to go into another explorer and prospector story, and he found gold too, and he disappeared. And then we'll also have a reading of the original Jackson letter, and we'll do that in the next video, so we can continue on with the story and not make it so long, so that people have an opportunity to go through this first video, get a good idea of the story itself, and then we'll get into more prospector stories of people that went to look for it. And the next gentleman also found gold in this area, so he also disappeared too. So Anyhow, we'll get into those details in the next video, so watch for the part 2, and we will continue this story going down a couple more tangents and reading the original Jackson letter.